I was balancing a cup of hot coffee in one hand and my laptop bag in the other when I stepped out the door and instantly froze like I had walked into a crime scene. Not one, not two, but 5 oversized SUVs were jammed into my private driveway like a game of suburban Tetris gone wrong. One was parked horizontally, completely trapping in my truck, which I needed to get to a make-or-break meeting that morning. Taped to my mailbox was a piece of cardboard with the words HOA Event Overflow Parking written in Sharpie. I blinked. Was this a prank? Then I spotted her. Karen, the HOA president, standing with a walkie-talkie in her hand, directing people like she was leading an evacuation drill. I rushed over, still holding my coffee, and demanded to know why 5 random people were using my property like a public lot. She gave me a casual glance and said, "We assumed you'd be fine with it. Be neighborly." I almost choked on my coffee. That was the exact moment I realized I wasn't dealing with a miscommunication. I was dealing with a full-scale neighborhood invasion, and I knew this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. It all began just 2 months after I had finally finished renovating my home. A modest house on the corner lot with a wider-than-usual driveway, it had been a fixer-upper I poured everything into. I wasn't the social type and had zero interest in HOA meetings, but I had paid all my dues and stayed out of trouble. Apparently, that made me the perfect target. The HOA's new initiative was a series of weekend community events meant to boost neighborhood morale. Bake sales, wine tastings, yoga socials, even a movie night. Sounds nice on paper, until you realize they scheduled everything in the cul-de-sac without consulting every homeowner. And since my house didn't face directly into the center of the court, they just assumed I wouldn't mind if guests used my driveway to park. What started as one SUV during a pancake breakfast turned into full-on blockades during every event. After the first incident, I reached out to the HOA via email, assuming it was a one-off mistake. No response. I left a voicemail on their hotline. Still nothing. The second event came with triple the traffic, and this time I found a toddler drawing with chalk on the side of my garage while her parents unpacked a cooler on my lawn. I confronted the couple, and they looked at me like I was interrupting their vacation. "Oh, we were told parking here was fine," the man said, waving toward Karen's clipboard crew a few houses down. I marched over to Karen and asked what on earth she was thinking. She said she had sent an email to the HOA mailing list and that my silence was taken as agreement. When I told her I never received the email, she raised an eyebrow and said, "Sounds like a personal tech issue." That week, I put out orange cones at the end of my driveway. The next Saturday they were gone. Just vanished. My Ring camera showed a teenager moving them aside, then Karen walking by minutes later without saying a word. I printed a sign that said "Private property, no parking." It was defaced with a smiley face and the word "Buskill." Then came the cracked paver, which I found after a pickup truck scraped its way up the edge of the drive and left a nasty tire gouge. When I tried calling a tow company to remove one of the cars blocking my path, the dispatcher apologized and said they couldn't help because the HOA had issued a mass notice to all local companies warning of false calls during neighborhood events. My jaw hit the floor. By the fourth event, it was clear this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was targeted disregard. I skipped one of the events just to observe. I sat in my window with a notepad like a surveillance agent, documenting every time someone stepped on my lawn, leaned against my truck, or parked crookedly enough to block access to my side yard. I captured 3 people letting their dogs relieve themselves on my bushes, one person spilling wine across my concrete path, and another woman who actually climbed onto my porch to take a phone call like she lived there. The audacity was almost artistic. The final straw came during a rare but intense thunderstorm that knocked out power to half the neighborhood. I work from home and needed to get to a data hub across town to upload files for a government contractor. But the driveway was blocked again. I sprinted outside in the rain, slipping on the wet concrete, only to find 3 cars in the way and their owners nowhere to be found. My generator wouldn't kick on because the electric company couldn't get to the emergency meter. They physically couldn't reach it with the parked cars obstructing the access panel. That night, I sat on my porch, drenched and furious, staring at the puddles forming in my yard and the smeared tire tracks left behind by people who didn't care one bit. That's when I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't going to yell anymore. I wasn't going to plead or send passive-aggressive emails. I was going to engineer a solution that even the boldest HOA member couldn't ignore. My background is in mechanical systems design. I'd worked on precision automated gates, smart home installations, and even motion-triggered security systems for industrial clients. It was time to bring those skills home. Literally. I grabbed my notebook, sketched out the blueprint for a custom-built retractable driveway gate, and started listing materials. But the crown jewel wasn't just the gate. It was what would go under it. Retractable parking spikes. The kind you see in commercial garages, only customized. These would be solar-powered, timed to activate during certain hours, and outfitted with a plate recognition camera that logged every vehicle attempting to breach the line. I would include speaker alerts and auto-notification to my phone anytime the perimeter was crossed. It wasn't overkill. It was personal protection. I wasn't trying to escalate. I was building a clear boundary. If the HOA didn't respect paperwork or politeness, maybe they'd respect 3 inches of unforgiving steel. Over the next few days, I quietly ordered supplies, scheduled some concrete work under the guise of a driveway enhancement project, and installed new wiring under the surface. My neighbors thought I was just fixing the paver. Karen passed by one morning, sipping a green smoothie and glancing over. "Looks like someone's finally upgrading. Good for you." She said it with that sing-song tone only she could deliver. The kind that hides a threat behind faux encouragement. I gave her a smile and replied, "Just wait until you see the grand reveal." In truth, I was still playing the long game. I knew another event was on the horizon. I had seen the flyers tucked into mailbox slots. The HOA wine tasting was scheduled for that weekend. All I had to do was finish the setup, run my final test, and wait. Because the next time someone tried to turn my property into a parking lot, they were going to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget. And unlike their parties, mine came with consequences. Permanent, pointy, unforgettable consequences. The morning after I finalized my blueprints, I woke up with a rare mix of determination and mischief swirling in my chest. The concrete was scheduled to be poured at noon, and I had already cleared out the topsoil at the foot of the driveway to prep the area for my retractable spike. I wasn't building a moat or a fortress, but I sure wasn't going to keep rolling over for people who treated my land like a community picnic zone. Every trip I made to the hardware store had me smirking like a cartoon villain. Motion sensors, steel rods, solar wiring, even a backup battery bank in case of another outage. I wasn't building a driveway anymore. I was constructing a line in the sand, and this time it would bite back. Before any installation began, I made sure I wasn't giving Karen or the HOA any ammunition. I went down to the city's zoning office with my property map, permit application, and a printed copy of the HOA's own bylaws. The city clerk took one look at my detailed documentation and said, "You're more thorough than most contractors." I had made sure the property line was crystal clear. No easements, no shared access. And the kicker? The previous owner had revoked all communal use permissions 5 years ago when the HOA first tried to build a mailbox post on the edge of the yard. It was all on file. I even requested certified copies. That paperwork would prove invaluable later, and I knew it. Back home, I disguised the initial construction under the friendly label of a driveway security enhancement. That phrase sounded harmless, even responsible. It also conveniently didn't include the word spikes. The foundation trench was poured in 2 long, clean lines where the spikes would later emerge, and I laid the wiring conduit beneath them while the concrete was still wet. Karen drove by once in her golf cart, slowed down, and tried to act casual while scanning the scene. I gave her a polite wave and wiped my brow like a homeowner just doing his civic duty. She didn't say a word but narrowed her eyes like a cat smelling something unfamiliar. Over the next 3 days, I worked around the clock installing the pressure sensors, motion-activated cameras, and an infrared gate controller that interfaced with my phone. I added a failsafe that would retract the spikes if an ambulance or emergency vehicle siren was detected, just to make sure no one could claim I was endangering lives. The more tech I integrated, the more fun it became. I even installed a two-way speaker system connected to a camera that could project my voice remotely if someone dared to set foot on the concrete. The system was smart enough to send me a snapshot of the intruder, log the timestamp, and send a copy to a secure server. One of my friends joked that I was turning my driveway into a spy thriller set piece. I just grinned and said, "It's called deterrence." When the spike plates were finally fitted and covered with custom metal flaps disguised to look like part of the driveway, I stood back and admired the system. Clean, minimal, but ruthless. If someone rolled their tires onto my property without permission, they'd receive a loud warning, flashing LEDs, and then, if they kept going, the spikes would rise like shark fins through the pavement. The installation passed the self-test with flying colors. I rolled my truck in and out of the sensor field with ease. But the real test was coming soon, and I knew exactly when it would happen. Friday afternoon arrived, and with it came the inevitable HOA flyer stuffed into my mailbox. The paper was curled, ink slightly smeared, but the headline jumped out clearly. Neighborhood Wine Social Saturday, 4 p.m. Street parking encouraged. I snorted. Street parking, my foot. I could already hear Karen giving her speech to the new volunteers about how driveway number 12 is usually fine for overflow. I could almost see the clipboard in her hand. This time, I wasn't just ready, I was waiting. I prepped the system, charged every battery, and tested the speakers with a pre-recorded message. It said, clearly and calmly, "You are entering private property. This area is protected by an automated perimeter system. Please reverse immediately or your vehicle will be immobilized." The voice was mine, but digitized slightly, giving it a serious, almost dystopian edge. At exactly 3:30 p.m. on Saturday, I poured myself a soda, opened my porch umbrella, and settled in with my laptop. I didn't have to wait long. A silver Lexus SUV rolled around the bend, slowed, and paused at the foot of my driveway. I sipped casually. The driver, a middle-aged woman in oversized sunglasses and a floppy hat, looked down at something in her lap, probably a flyer, then drove forward. As soon as her tires hit the sensor, the system clicked alive. The red LED strip lit up along the edge, and the speakers kicked in. My warning message echoed off the garage and across the street. She froze. Her head turned side to side. She slowly reversed, blinking in disbelief. Then she rolled down her window and yelled, "Is this really necessary?" I stood and smiled. Very. She didn't even argue, just backed out and drove away. That was the moment I realized this might actually work. But it wouldn't be a proper field test without Karen herself. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, her golf cart came into view, cruising at HOA patrol speed. Behind her were 2 more cars trying to figure out where to park. She pointed toward my house. The first car hesitated. Then the second started to turn in. It crept forward hesitantly, like the driver sensed something was off. When the tires reached the sensors, the warning sounded again. This time, I switched to live mode on the speaker. I leaned into my mic and said, "You have 3 seconds to leave my property." The car stopped so abruptly it squealed. The reverse lights blinked on instantly. The driver looked like he'd seen a ghost. Karen finally noticed what was happening. She pulled up beside the retreating car, gesturing wildly. I walked over calmly, hands in my pockets. "Hi Karen," I said with a bright tone. "Lovely day for a wine party." She eyed the driveway like it had grown teeth. "What did you install here? You can't just install booby traps." I held up the city permit with a smile. "Fully authorized security deterrent system." The city approved it. Want to see the documents? She opened her mouth, then shut it. Her eyes narrowed. This is excessive. I laughed gently. So is blocking someone's truck during a storm. Remember that night? Her face went pale for half a second before the fake politeness returned. We'll be reviewing this with the board, she snapped. I waved cheerfully. You do that. In the meantime, tell your guests to use the actual street. The rest of the event went by without a single tire crossing onto my property. I watched in amusement as guests circled for legal parking like vultures around a limited buffet. One parked 2 blocks away and carried a bottle of wine like a soldier transporting treasure. As the sun set and the music from the event faded, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: peace. My space had been defended, my line had been drawn, and my message had been sent. What I didn't expect was that someone had been recording part of the incident on their phone from across the street. They uploaded the video to a local neighborhood watch group, and by the next morning, it had gone semi-viral. The clip showed the spikes rising, the warning voice booming, and Karen's flustered reaction, all in a tight 45-second clip. The comments started rolling in. Then came the shares. Then came the Reddit post that would take things to a whole new level. What began as a personal line in the concrete was about to become a digital landslide. But I was just getting started. By Sunday morning, my phone was buzzing nonstop. I hadn't told anyone outside my closest friend group about the system I'd built, but suddenly, I was getting texts from people I hadn't spoken to in years. The video of Karen's standoff at my driveway had exploded online. Someone from across the street had posted it with the caption, "HOA tries to use man's driveway for wine party parking, meets his driveway's defense system instead." Within hours, it had spread from a neighborhood watch group to a Reddit thread, then to a local meme page, and then to a suburban homeowners group that apparently specialized in HOA drama. I opened the video and watched it from a new angle, zoomed in, high resolution, clear audio. The spikes rising. The LED flashing red. My digitized voice warning the driver. Then Karen pulling up, flailing her arms like a malfunctioning windmill, and my deadpan response. Want to see the documents? The comments were brutal. One user wrote, "This guy's a genius. Where do I order this setup?" Another said, "Karen just got drive-by humbled. Someone nominate this man for HOA president immediately." The clip was less than a minute long, but it had already racked up tens of thousands of views. Some people started DMing me asking for tutorials. Others wanted to send donations. A guy in Florida offered me a free security drone. The unexpected fame was hilarious and gratifying, but what really satisfied me was that Karen had been exposed without me even lifting a finger to share the footage. All I had done was protect my own property. The internet had done the rest. By Monday afternoon, the HOA sent an email blast with the subject line, "Concerning driveway activity." It was a laughably vague attempt at damage control. The email mentioned a resident who had installed an intimidating mechanism that might confuse or distress visitors. They reminded the community that mutual cooperation and goodwill are the foundation of our neighborhood. The irony made me laugh so hard I nearly choked on my sandwich. Karen didn't name me directly, of course, but everyone knew. In fact, 2 neighbors came by that day just to shake my hand. One of them, Mr. Delgado from across the street, whispered, "Been dealing with her nonsense for years. You're a legend now." I went about my week like normal, but the undercurrent had changed. No one parked in my driveway. No one even walked across it. It was like an invisible force field had been drawn in concrete. The funniest moment came on Wednesday when I saw a pizza delivery guy slow down, check the address, and park 2 houses away, then walk the food the rest of the way just to avoid triggering the spike. But Karen wasn't going to let this go. Not her. On Thursday evening, she knocked on my door, clipboard in hand, wearing that forced, overly wide smile she used when she was preparing to say something outrageous. I didn't invite her in. I simply stepped outside and leaned against my railing. She launched into a speech about neighborhood aesthetics and creating an environment that isn't threatening to visitors. I waited patiently until she finally got to the point, demanding that I dismantle the spike system because it created what she called an atmosphere of aggression. I let her finish, then told her the only aggressive thing I'd seen was her HOA guests vandalizing my yard and blocking emergency access. I offered again, politely, to provide her with the permits and documentation proving the legality of my setup. She didn't accept. She just said, "You'll be hearing from the board." I shrugged. "I look forward to it." The board met 2 nights later in a hastily organized meeting at the community center. I showed up early with a binder of documentation and a tablet loaded with all the footage. Karen and her small crew, 2 sycophantic board members and a guy I didn't recognize, sat at the front like they were preparing for trial. They tried to start by claiming I had violated unspecified rules about aggressive modifications. I let them talk for exactly 5 minutes. Then I opened my binder and began presenting. First, I showed the city-approved permits for my driveway upgrade and security system. Then I played the footage of multiple vehicles parking without consent, blocking utilities, and even the diaper-changing incident on my tailgate. The room grew quiet. Karen tried to interrupt, but I cut her off, pointing out that none of the vehicles had been invited and that her written note posted on my mailbox was, in fact, an unauthorized declaration over private property. Then I dropped the final hammer. I had a letter from the zoning commissioner stating that not only was my installation legal, but that Karen's repeated use of private property for public events constituted a civil violation. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the new guy, who turned out to be the HOA's legal counsel, leaned forward and asked me one question. "Do you have documentation showing the driveway is fully your property and not under shared use?" I handed it to him. He scanned it, nodded, and turned to the board. "This is airtight," he said. "If we continue this line of complaint, the HOA will be liable for prior trespass events." Karen looked like she'd been slapped. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. The board adjourned the meeting shortly after. No vote was taken against me. No warning letter was issued. And as I walked out, 3 people came up to thank me for finally putting the HOA in its place. One woman actually whispered, "Do you do consulting?" The fallout over the next few days was glorious. Someone had leaked the video to a local news outlet. A quick segment aired on Channel 6 titled, "Local Man Installs Genius Anti-HOA Parking System." They blurred Karen's face but left mine visible, with a caption that read, "Engineer turns driveway into no parking zone, internet cheers." The story spread even further. One YouTuber made a reaction video called "Karen vs. the Spikes. Best HOA Story Ever." Comments poured in. The internet had chosen its side. Karen, meanwhile, tried to pretend nothing had happened. But the vibe had shifted. Her usual tone at board meetings turned quieter. She stopped bringing her clipboard everywhere. One day, she passed me in her golf cart and didn't say a word. She even avoided eye contact. More neighbors began approaching me privately, telling me stories of their own conflicts with her, fines for lawn height, for leaving Christmas lights up too long, for hosting family in their own homes. It became clear Karen wasn't just unpopular, she was resented. My act of defense had opened the floodgates. 2 weeks after the driveway incident, a petition circulated calling for a special HOA election. It didn't mention me, but the timing wasn't subtle. The community had gotten a taste of what it meant to push back, and they weren't about to forget it. I hadn't intended to become a symbol of resistance. I just wanted my driveway back. But now, the board's grip was cracking, and Karen's days of unchecked power were numbered. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the treetops, I realized how satisfying it was to see boundaries respected again. Not just physical ones but moral ones. Karen had walked all over people for years under the guise of policy. All it took was one quiet pushback, one line drawn in steel and concrete, and everything began to unravel. I hadn't just installed spikes. I'd built a message, one that rang louder than her walkie-talkie ever could. And the neighborhood was finally listening. The weeks that followed were quieter than I had anticipated. The HOA stopped holding events near my home, and no one dared use my driveway. The gate system had become a neighborhood legend, and for once I was left in peace. But peace, as I learned quickly, was only the eye of the storm. I knew Karen wouldn't accept defeat so easily. That woman thrived on control, and my driveway fortress had become a symbol of everything she couldn't manage. So when I got a certified letter in the mail bearing the HOA's logo, I didn't even flinch. I opened it slowly, sipping coffee, half expecting to be served with some kind of made-up violation. And I was right. The letter claimed I had installed aggressive defensive infrastructure that violated community harmony aesthetics, a phrase so vague it could have applied to anything from a gnome statue to a flamethrower turret. I laughed out loud, not just at the absurdity of it, but at the irony of the timing. The night before, my story had been featured in a national HOA horror stories segment online. The footage of Karen screeching into her walkie-talkie while the spikes hissed from the ground had now been turned into GIFs, memes, and even a mock trailer for a fake horror movie called Attack of the Driveway. I had become, for better or worse, a poster child for suburban rebellion. The letter tried to sound official, but it was drenched in desperation. What made it even funnier was that the attached fine, a one-time $250 notice, was laughably invalid under our HOA agreement, which strictly prohibited enforcement of rules that weren't voted on by majority membership. I knew this, and more importantly, so did Karen. But this was her Hail Mary. She was hoping I'd blink. Instead of responding immediately, I waited. I made copies of the letter, annotated the bylaws, and forwarded everything to my lawyer, a no-nonsense friend named Trey who happened to live 2 neighborhoods over and loathed HOAs more than I did. His return email said only, "Let's make this fun." That weekend, I attended another HOA board meeting, this time arriving early with Trey in tow. Karen looked smug until he introduced himself. The color drained from her face. She tried to rush through the agenda, pretending the letter wasn't a topic, but Trey calmly interrupted and requested that it be added to the discussion. Another board member whispered, clearly uncomfortable, and the vote to add the agenda item passed. Karen had no choice. When Trey stood to speak, it was like watching a courtroom drama unfold in slow motion. He went through each point of the letter, debunked every fabricated violation, and then presented printouts of the bylaws highlighting every rule the HOA itself had violated in the process. He also reminded them that I had a standing record of trespass incidents involving HOA event guests, which included physical evidence and footage. By the time he was finished, Karen's smile had curdled into a scowl. Then he dropped the final piece. A formal letter of liability warning the HOA that any further attempts to intimidate or penalize me without cause would result in a civil suit against both the board and its president, personally. The room fell into a stunned silence. Karen tried to respond, but one of her own board members leaned forward and said, "Karen, maybe we should just move on." Another nodded. The HOA's lawyer, who had clearly been advised about this in advance, simply said, "I recommend we drop it here." That moment marked the end of Karen's dominance. Her grip was slipping, and everyone in the room knew it. I didn't need to say a word. The silence said everything. The fallout came quickly. Word spread through the neighborhood that Karen had tried to find me and gotten legally smacked down. People started posting clips of Trey's speech online. He didn't even know he was being recorded. A neighbor uploaded the full video under the title "HOA President Gets Legally Humiliated." The comments section exploded. Some of the board members who had once supported her began distancing themselves. One even publicly apologized to me, saying he hadn't realized how far things had gone. What surprised me most was how many people started opening up. Suddenly, folks who had been silent before were sharing stories of Karen's bullying. A widow down the block confessed she had been fined for having a mobility ramp that didn't match the color palette. Another family said they were forced to remove a vegetable garden because it was deemed too rustic. A group of homeowners, emboldened by what had happened, began circulating a petition to restructure the board. Karen's name wasn't on the document, but everyone knew who the target was. By the second week of the petition's circulation, nearly half the neighborhood had signed it. Karen, visibly rattled, started going door to door trying to salvage her influence. I saw her knock on one neighbor's house and watched the door never open. At another, the door opened and she was met with a short exchange and a headshake. No one was buying it anymore. Her reign of passive-aggressive memos and driveway diplomacy was coming to an end. I wasn't even the one leading the charge. I just stood back and watched, amused, as the same people who once looked the other way now stood up one by one. Then came the town hall. An open meeting where the community could vote to amend board positions. The hall was packed. Folding chairs filled every row. People stood along the walls. It felt more like an election rally than an HOA gathering. Karen, still clinging to her title, tried to rally with a speech about community values and neighborhood image. But when she said, "We must protect the standards that make our community beautiful," someone near the back shouted, "Like stealing driveways?" The crowd erupted in laughter. Her face froze. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it short. I walked up, held up my original driveway permit, and said, "All I ever wanted was to be left alone. To not have my driveway used without permission. To not be treated like a second-class citizen on my own land." I paused. But I realized this wasn't just about me. This was about boundaries. And when those get crossed, it's not just concrete that gets damaged, it's trust. The room was silent when I sat down. Not tense, just thoughtful. And then they clapped. Slowly at first, then it grew. Karen didn't speak again. The vote was taken. The result was overwhelming. Karen was voted off the board along with 2 of her loyalists. In their place, 3 new members were elected, 2 of whom I had never met before, but who had supported the petition and voiced their opposition to HOA overreach. It felt like the end of a chapter. A long, ridiculous, petty, frustrating chapter, but one that had finally closed. After the meeting, Karen left without speaking to anyone. She didn't make eye contact. She just got into her car and drove away. It wasn't the victory dance some might have hoped for, but it was enough for me. I went home that night, turned on my security monitor, and watched the footage of my driveway, clean and undisturbed, glowing under the soft security lights. I didn't need signs or threats anymore. The message was built right into the concrete. That night, I realized something deeper had changed. Not just in the HOA, but in me. I used to think keeping my head down and staying out of trouble was the best way to survive suburban politics. But boundaries only mean something if you're willing to defend them. And sometimes, the most peaceful solution isn't the one that avoids conflict. It's the one that ends it. Permanently. It had been nearly a month since Karen was voted off the HOA board, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. People walked with a little more confidence. Conversations on the sidewalk didn't carry the hushed tone of fear that used to shadow anything HOA-related. Kids rode their bikes freely without parents constantly checking over their shoulders. The new board members began reversing a lot of Karen's legacy rules, starting with the most outrageous ones, like fines for non-standard porch furniture and demands for seasonal decor restrictions. For the first time since I moved in, I felt like I was living in a neighborhood instead of a poorly disguised dictatorship. But if I thought the drama had truly ended, I was wrong. Karen wasn't done. Not yet. It started subtly. One morning, I found a few scratches on my truck's rear fender. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened, so I checked my security footage. There it was, barely visible in the early morning light, a woman-shaped figure walking suspiciously close to the vehicle, keys in hand. The resolution caught enough of her profile to erase any doubt. It was Karen. She was wearing a hoodie and sunglasses like she thought she was in a spy movie. I didn't react. Not yet. I saved the footage and added it to a growing digital folder I had labeled Karen's greatest hit. A few days later, I noticed that the gate control panel for the retractable spikes had been tampered with. It was a small change, but the wiring looked off. Someone had unscrewed the faceplate and tried to mess with the connections underneath. Fortunately, the backup security system had captured the tampering attempt, and the built-in tamper alert had sent a silent ping to my phone. I reviewed the footage and sure enough, it was her again. Middle of the night, flashlight in one hand, tiny screwdriver in the other. She tried to disable it. She really thought she could out-engineer me. I guess losing her HOA throne wasn't enough. She wanted revenge, and she wanted it quietly. But that was her mistake. Because I was done playing quiet, I filed a formal police report the next morning. The officer who showed up had seen the viral driveway video and recognized me immediately. I handed over the footage of both incidents and laid out the pattern of harassment. The officer watched silently, jaw tight, then nodded and said, "You've got more documentation than most of our cases. We'll take it from here." They didn't even bother with a warning. They issued a citation for trespassing and attempted vandalism. Karen was served the next day, and her response was as loud as it was predictable. She showed up on my property that evening screaming about defamation and legal retaliation. Unfortunately for her, I was already live recording the moment she stepped onto my lawn. I didn't even speak. I just stood there with my arms crossed as she unleashed a torrent of threats, accusations, and half-baked legal jargon. When she finally noticed the camera mounted above the porch, she went pale and stormed off. The very next morning, she tried again. Only this time, she didn't come alone. She brought a man with her, someone I didn't recognize at first. He was tall, thin, with slicked-back hair and a briefcase that screamed I'm probably not a real lawyer. They marched up my driveway like they were going to serve me papers, but the moment they stepped over the buried sensor, the spikes triggered. The loud click, the warning voice, the rising steel, it all happened in perfect synchronization. The man yelped and stumbled backwards so fast he nearly tripped. Karen screamed again. I stepped out with a cup of tea in my hand and said, "Unless that briefcase contains a court order, you're trespassing again. Please leave before I add another incident to the police file." The man muttered something about miscommunication and hurried away. Karen followed, swearing under her breath. I didn't even bother replying. The system spoke for itself. That weekend, I hosted a small barbecue in my backyard. Nothing fancy. Just a few neighbors, burgers, and a playlist of classic rock. It wasn't about celebration. It was about reclaiming normalcy. Mr. Delgado brought his famous jalapeno cornbread. The widow with the mobility ramp came too, and for the first time since moving in, I saw her genuinely smiling. We didn't talk about Karen. We didn't need to. Her absence from the board and the way the community had pushed back had already spoken volumes. People were starting to believe they had agency again. And that, more than anything, felt like a real victory. But Karen had one final card to play. One night, around 3 a.m., my security app pinged repeatedly. It wasn't just a single motion trigger. It was a series of them, one after the other. I sat up in bed, checked the feed, and stared in disbelief. Karen had returned, this time with bolt cutters. She had brought a duffel bag full of tools and was working her way around the side of my house, aiming for the wiring box connected to the gate system. What she didn't know was that the newer system I installed after the tampering incident included a panic alert. The moment she cut into the wrong cable, it sent a silent alarm straight to local authorities. She was still crouched near the panel when the patrol car pulled up, lights off until the last second. The officer stepped out and caught her mid-cut. She tried to run. Didn't make it 6 feet before she was tackled into my hedge. I watched it unfold in real time, then opened my front door and walked out slowly as the lights flashed and the situation was quickly contained. Karen was handcuffed, hysterical, sputtering about being framed. The officers didn't say much, just asked me to confirm the footage and system layout. I did. She was charged on the spot: criminal trespassing, property damage, and attempted sabotage. No one defended her. No one intervened. In fact, the new HOA president showed up the next day just to apologize. He shook my hand and said, "We're going to make sure she never has this kind of power again." Karen's arrest was the final chapter in a story I never asked to be a part of. She moved out of the neighborhood a few weeks later, quietly and bitterly, her house put up for sale with no open house event, no farewell notes, not even a "for sale" sign that stayed up longer than necessary. The new board amended several bylaws to ensure that no president could act unilaterally without check. My driveway remained untouched. The spikes stayed in place, fully operational but rarely needed. And me? I went back to living my life. Quiet, simple, unbothered. One day, a neighbor stopped by and asked if I'd ever considered starting a YouTube channel about home defense and smart systems. I laughed it off at first, but the idea stuck. Within a few weeks, I had launched a small channel called Driveway Defender. It was half tech review, half storytelling, and full of subtle jabs at authoritarian HOAs. The opening video? A breakdown of the spike system, set to dramatic music, titled The Karen Defense Grid. It blew up faster than I expected. Messages poured in. People from across the country shared their own HOA horror stories and asked how they could take their power back. The story that started with a stolen driveway ended up sparking something much bigger. It wasn't about spikes or sensors. It was about drawing a line. Not a metaphorical one, but a physical, undeniable boundary that reminded people they didn't have to accept being walked over. And in a world where entitlement often screams the loudest, sometimes it takes a quiet hum of rising steel to finally shut it up.